All right, so to be respectful of everyone's time, if it's okay, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So again, thank you all for joining us today. It's exciting to see some new faces on here. For those of you who I have not met, my name is Brittany Armentrout. I'm the local military liaison for the Central Virginia and Tidewater regions. And for those who may not be familiar with or who are new to the Barry Robinson Center, we are a not-for-profit residential treatment center that exclusively services military-connected children and adolescents ages 6 through 17 with mental or behavioral health challenges. We also have our community-based programs, which is not military-specific. That includes our new ABA program, which you'll be hearing more about today, as well as our intensive outpatient substance use program and our foster care program. So if you have any questions following our training today, or if you'd simply like more information about one of our programs, I will share my contact information in the chat box today. So you can feel free to reach out to me at your convenience. You can text me, call me, email me, whatever is most convenient for you. And I can link you with the right person depending upon which program you're interested in. So before we kick off our presentation today, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers. Today we have Miss Nancy Harris-Kroll, as she became a certified applied behavioral analyst in 2009, specializing in the recognition and treatment of behavioral issues with those identified as having autism. Today, she is the owner and clinical director at the Learning Resource Center, as well as a part-time BCBA with us here at the Barry Robinson Center. Nancy specializes in verbal behavior and testing and treatment for clients ages 18 months to adult. We also have Miss Ashley Bowman. She is our ABA program manager. She began her career in ABA and found her passion for the science 9 years ago. She joined Barry Robinson last November and has been instrumental in setting up our new ABA program, which was launched this past May. Ashley has worked with clients ages 18 months to young adult with a wide variety of diagnoses, problem behaviors, and modalities of communication. I do want to note today that this training will be recorded, and following the training, we will send an evaluation form via email. That email will also include instructions on how to return the evaluation in order to receive your certificate of completion for this training. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Nancy and Ashley right now. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, if you'll just type those in the chat box, we'll go ahead and answer those all at the end, all at once. So Ashley and Nancy, go ahead and take it away for us.
All righty, okay, great. I'll just start sharing our screen. There we go. That way we're not distracted.
Are we just sharing that?
There we go. Okay. So let me minimize it. Okay.
There we go.
So thank you, Brittany, for the introduction. Again, I'm Ashley Bowman, and this is Nancy Harris-Kroll, and we want to thank you guys for joining our webinar. So chit chat and all that, how to communicate when it feels like you can't.
So we're going to start off today with a couple of scenarios, and you don't have to say anything out loud. We're just going to go over what if you're at the doctor's office with your child and your child is refusing to go back to the nurse's station to get weighed or go to the exam room. They're screaming, kicking, flopping on the floor, refusing to move. Your child is not verbal. What do you do? A, you pick your child up, reschedule the appointment and leave. B, you sit on the floor and talk softly to your child and try to get them to calm down. and then go into the exam room. C, you ask for help from the nursing staff. D, you swear you're never bringing your child to the doctor again. E, none of the above. So what you're going to do now is you're going to indicate your answer in the audience poll, okay? And we're going to go over these questions at the end of the webinar, and we'll see if you change your answer in any way, okay, when we get to the end. So you can just put your answer in the chat box.
And then while you guys are doing that, we'll go on to the next
Would
one.
you like us to just send that to you?
Nope, you're going to put it in the chat box and they'll compile them, and we'll move on to the next one.
To everyone, or to you, Ashley, or to someone else in the chat box? Do you want it to go to everybody?
Just everyone. It can just go to everyone.
Yeah, this is more so for you to review to see if your answers change by the end of the webinar.
Got it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
And Nancy and Ashley, do we also want to note this PowerPoint is available to everyone?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. It is available to everybody on the Barry Robinson website.
Mm-hmm.
It's available now if you want to go get it, or you can get it after the webinar. It's up to you. Yeah. Okay.
Just as a resource.
Yeah. So the second scenario, you're at the store with your child. It's clear they want something, but they're not able to tell you what it is. And they begin to get frustrated and start to scream and cry. What can you do? A, begin pulling things off shelves and asking your child if this is what they want. B, tell them to please be quiet, you're in a store. C, leave and shop online. D, none of the above. Same thing. You'll just indicate your answer in the audience poll and just send it to everyone.
Okay. So before we go into the details of the scenarios and communication, we want to take a step back and break down behavior. So what is behavior, right? So behavior in layman's terms is just anything that a dead man can't do. That is truly a definition for behavior. So it can be actions or reactions of an organism in relation to the environment. Behavior can be conscious, unconscious, overt or covert, or conditioned or unconditioned. It's influenced by culture, attitudes, emotions, values, ethics, authority, persuasion, or coercion. The stimulus, which is the change in the environment, might be something such as a sound, a smell, a color, or another individual. The stimulus can be related to the internal state of an animal or mammal, such as being hungry or cold. So me speaking right now is behavior. And you guys are the reason why I'm speaking right now. My heart beating is behavior, and me drinking water or coffee in this case is behavior.
So behavior is a little bit different when you're talking about it in our terms. In layman's terms, when you talk about behavior from a mom's point of view, it might be, oh, my child is kicking and screaming, which is certainly behavior. But in our terms, it's anything that anybody does. Speaking is behavior. And like Ashley said, if a dead man can do it, then it's not behavior. And that was actually a question on my test that I took to be a BCBA. It was like, what's the dead man's test? Which was a bizarre, it was a gimme question. So I was happy it was on my test.
Yeah. So just like Nancy said, a behavior, if you say if my child's having a behavior, it's always important to describe it too, because literally anything that a dead man cannot do is behavior. Right?
Yeah, that's true. Like if Ashley had come to my office and said, hey, you have to help me with my child's behavior. It's bad behavior. I would say, oh, tell me what that behavior looks like. Because in order for me to help her with her child's behavior, I need to know exactly what the behavior is. So telling somebody to tell me what the behavior looks like is a little easier for them instead of saying describe it. Tell me what it looks like is usually the phrase I use.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you say too?
Exactly. What does it look like? Because my definition of a tantrum may be different than Nancy's definition of a tantrum. Actually, ours are probably very similar.
Yeah.
But our definition may be different.
I think they probably are.
Yeah, right, yeah. So it's always important to understand that. And then how our behavior is influenced is important too. And that leads into that behavior always has a function. There is always a reason for behavior, even the really bad behavior that we don't want to see, the kicking, the screaming, the biting, the spitting, or me speaking right now, right? I'm speaking because you guys are the stimulus in my environment, asking me to teach you more about communication, kind of a thing. Or if I'm thirsty, I'm going to have some more of my coffee, or because I love coffee so much, I'm going to continue to drink coffee. There's always a reason for our behavior. And just like my blood flowing to keep me alive, kind of a thing. And like I mentioned before, there's always a reason for a problem of behavior. There's 4 main functions of behavior in behavior analysis: escape, attention, tangible, or sensory. And that includes escape or denied access to tangibles and that sort of thing too. So we go in to determine why the behavior is happening or why it's not happening by analyzing the environment around the behavior. But we go in knowing that there's always a reason for behavior. So the child's not just kicking and screaming for no reason. There's always a reason, whether it's hard to tell at the beginning or not. So behavior as communication. Behavior is communication. So it can tell us more than we may be able to vocalize. So the kicking and screaming, again, there's a reason for that behavior. And it's a form of communication, right? It's them trying to tell us something, or that something is wrong, or my needs aren't being met. So you can even think of an infant crying, right? Those who have babies, the baby isn't just crying for no reason. It's crying because they're hungry, or they need to be changed, or they want attention. And usually mothers over time will be able to tell the difference in the cries, right? That's a hungry cry. That's a I need to be changed cry. And it's the same type of thing. So what if you're older than an infant without a developed form of communication, right? So how are you getting your needs met? You know, and there's different forms of behavior or problematic behavior that form into types of communication, because the child has learned over time that when I do kick, scream, cry, it not only gets someone's attention to give me something, whatever it is, but it's somehow getting my needs met. So there are many different types of communication. So when we talk about communication or behavior as communication, we're not only talking about vocal verbal or vocal communication, right? There's vocal verbal, there's sign language or American Sign Language. There's PECS, which is the Picture Exchange of Communication System, which I'm a big fan of. There's AAC, or the Augmented and Alternative Communication. Even gestures or pointing, eye gaze, and more are all different forms of communication. So let's talk about verbal versus nonverbal. We often hear parents discuss their children being nonverbal, or someone with autism as being nonverbal, when that may not actually be the case. Nonverbal does not mean non-vocal. Nonverbal means no form of communication to get their needs met. So no form. They can't use sign language, or they're not using sign language, they're not using PECS, they're not using vocal communication. And so verbal behavior is being able to communicate and have an audience. So reinforcement is mediated by a listener. So me speaking right now is verbal communication. It's vocal verbal communication, because you guys, my audience, is what's mediating my behavior. And so if a child is truly nonverbal, a communication modality should be their number one goal, along with behavior reductions or problematic behavior reductions, such as self-injury or dangerous behavior. And 40% of children on the autism spectrum are considered nonverbal. What I don't know is if that is at any point in their life, or if they remain nonverbal for the majority of their life.
It's at any point, although the window of opportunity starts to close if they haven't received early intervention services. And if they reach the age of, say, 8-ish, without exhibiting verbal behavior, to a certain extent. You may want to start to, if you haven't already, interject sign language
Yes.
and or PECS
Mhm.
with the verbal, just because you need to have some kind of valid communication system going on.
Right. Yes, because communication is what gets our needs met based on our audience, right? So gestures, I'm pointing to my coffee, and eye gaze even. Or there's been times where children have pulled mom to the fridge or have reached mom's hand toward a bottle of water. Those are all still forms of communication. So as I mentioned earlier, vocal verbal is spoken language, and it's the reinforcement for it is mediated by a listener or an audience. So the only reason I'm speaking right now is because of you guys. Thank you. And yeah, I was just checking my notes, make sure. But this is not the only form of communication. I just really want to reiterate that, because the purpose of communication is to get our needs met, and vocal verbal language is just one way of doing that.
So one of the things that I spend a lot of time educating people on is the more please, thank you dilemma and debate. It is a difficult thing to converse with teachers and speech and language pathologists about, because we do have a difference of opinion. When you have children that aren't verbal, one of the issues is getting them to communicate so that their wants and needs are met, particularly if they're exhibiting maladaptive behavior and are becoming more and more frustrated in their inability to communicate. So a long time ago, it was thought that if they taught children the sign for more, at least they would be able to sign what they wanted. But what ends up happening is the child doesn't really equate the sign for more with the item in which they want. They just know that they get something when they sign more. A better use of sign language would be to teach them still a general sign, but maybe the sign for drink. So if they want a drink, you teach them the sign for drink. And if they want more drink, you teach them drink, as opposed to more, because more is such a general sign, they really don't know what they're signing they want more of, if that makes sense to you. So we tend to teach children the name for something, and if it's a category such as drink, we'll teach them the general category name and then move to the specific as they're ready. So we would teach them drink for anything that was a drink, and then teach them the more specific drink name as they were ready for it, such as water, milk, juice, and so forth. We've had a lot of success when we teach it that way, because kids don't tend to get confused. We were having a group of kids that would come in requesting everything as more. And so when we would try and teach them the label for something, you know, what is this? They would say more. And so we had to unlearn, if you will, the label they had attached to it and teach them the correct label. All right. So I'm showing you here American Sign Language, ASL. Probably most of you have seen this or pictures of it, but you may not be aware of the number of different sign languages that are available for people. There are 135 different sign languages. And I knew there were a lot, but honestly, until I was doing my research for this webinar, I had no idea that there were 135. And so there's a definition for American Sign Language up here. It's a noun. And it's a visual manual modality, basically, that has its own semantic and syntactic structure. It's used by individuals that are deaf. And this particular sign language, American Sign Language, ASL, is used by English-speaking individuals in America and in Canada. Great Britain has its own version of sign language called BSL, British Sign Language. And in Australia, they have their own version of sign language called Auslan, the Australian Sign Language. And what I also found very interesting is that most countries that share a spoken language don't share the same sign language, which I thought was very interesting. William Stoke, just as an aside, is the father of sign language. I guess it takes, somebody said to me in my office, how long does it take to become proficient at sign language? And I guess you could equate it to the amount of time it takes to learn a language, any language, 2 to 3 years to attain beginning to interim skills or intermediate skills, and then to become fluent, probably 2 years additionally beyond that. I myself am not fluent in sign language. I know enough to converse with clients. Ashley, what about you?
Yeah, about the same. I was actually working towards becoming certified in ASL, but I'm not fluent enough to converse outside of
When I
our
taught
clients.
high school at one point, I was much more fluent than I am now because I had a child that was deaf. And so I used it. But I think, it's like anything else, use it or lose it. So unless you're using it on a consistent basis, you lose the skill.
I can agree with that.
Yeah. So the next thing that I'm going to talk about is something called PECS, which is the abbreviation for Picture Exchange Communication System. And you may be familiar with this. Basically, it's a form of augmentative or alternative communication in which a person is taught to communicate by using cards with pictures on it, okay? And there is a specific PECS system that you can purchase and receive training on. There are also knockoffs, I guess you could call them, of PECS that you can download online that are free that have no training associated with them. But if you really want to use a PECS program, there are 6 phases in the training. And I would highly recommend becoming trained in it. I myself am trained, and I'm not a trainer, but the phases are, phase 1 is how to communicate. Phase 2 is distance and persistence. Phase 3 is picture discrimination. Excuse me. Phase 4 is sentence structure using PECS. Phase 5 is answering questions. And the last phase is commenting, how you would comment. It's interesting. I do think if you're really wanting to set up a PECS program, professional training is really required in order to implement it as it's designed. I do know plenty of people that will use PECS pictures just to communicate with people. And as long as you've got somebody guiding you to help you with that, I think you probably would be okay. So one of the things that was asked of me is, how do you figure out which to use? Which is best, sign language, PECS? How do you know what to use with whom? And, they all have pros and cons. In 1985, Jack Michael suggested that individuals with intellectual disabilities may acquire typography-based systems, including manual signs, more easily or more readily than systems requiring a developed scanning discrimination and selection repertoire. So, maybe sign language would be better. Sign systems require no additional equipment. They're portable. ASL provides a standard gesture for nearly all English language words. Signing can be performed and recognized from a distance. There's a strong relation between matching skills and sign language acquisition. And the size of vocabulary is potentially unlimited with sign language. Picture exchange-based systems require the use of equipment. Some words, like verbs, are very difficult to depict through symbols or pictures. And the listener must remain close to the speaker in order to see and respond to the picture exchange systems. Research findings indicate that children with autism and developmental disabilities acquire picture exchange responses to command or request for reinforcing items more easily and rapidly than signed responses. So there is that. Frankly, I always pair the verbal with either sign or PECS, no matter what I'm doing. And as Mindy said in the beginning, my history, my experience, and my first go-to is verbal behavior. And this is verbal behavior, but I always try and get kids talking first. And we're pretty good at that around here. And there's a whole system we use to get them there. But there are kids that, for whatever reason, speaking is not something that they are as good at as signing or PECS. So, sign language. A child with poor fine motor skills and a weak memory might have difficulty with learning and using manual signs. And if the child relies solely on sign language, his communication partners are limited to those people who are familiar with sign language. Okay. PECS doesn't require others to learn a new communication system. It's the picture and oftentimes the word is associated. PECS increases communication intent. Picture exchange was built upon giving kids a compelling reason to communicate, to get something they want. So they know what they want, they find the picture, they show it to someone so they can receive what's on that picture. They're getting their wants and their needs met. It facilitates expressive communication and helps communicate to initiate and seek out their communication partner rather than waiting to respond. So instead of passively waiting for someone to say what it is, because they can't, they're able to initiate, for oftentimes for the first time, what they want. Something that is not as easy to overcome. PECS has a limited vocabulary. I mean, there's so many cards that you can carry around. If you're a good artist, you can draw what you want and go offline. But because PECS, it relies on requesting, there's also little emphasis to learn adjectives, pronouns, or other basic concepts. So, there's some pros and cons to both. What you do is pick the best. And at some point, I have a visual. I thought it was right after that, but maybe it's down further. Okay, you go. Okay, you go.
So, and then there's also AAC devices, or the augmentative and alternative communication. Now, this can actually be even pointing or writing. But what we're going to talk about is the use of technology to communicate, and that's what people are most familiar with. There are aided systems and dedicated or non-dedicated systems. Let's see, but it can be used to replace speech or vocal verbal language or writing as a form of communication. Let's see, the non-dedicated devices are most common with our kiddos. So the use of a smartphone, a tablet, an iPhone, that sort of thing with AAC software on them, such as Proloco to Go or Touch Chat. And Proloco to Go is pretty common.
Yeah.
Pretty well
We
used.
have 3 kids here that use it.
Yeah.
Now, I don't profess to be really good at loading it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. And it's interesting to teach how to use Proloco to Go is very similar to how to teach PECS. And they use symbols to cover parts of speech or other collections of images. So very similar to PECS, it's just a picture that is on the screen. They touch it for cookie, and then the device speaks for them. But then that way their needs are still getting met with the use of these non-dedicated devices.
we have one client here that is amazing on that. He probably has 50 words in his repertoire. However, he comprehends everything, and he uses his device when people don't understand him, and he will speak in sentences on his device, and it is really how he communicates.
Yes.
It's very good, and he brings it with him everywhere, and really it would be what he would use in the case of an emergency, to let, say, a policeman know what his name was, what his address is, where he lives, or where he's coming from or going to. It's really a good thing for people.
Definitely, and it broadens the size of the audience too, because if a child were to walk up to me on the street and say, I need help using his AAC device, I know exactly that they need help, versus maybe a sign where if I didn't know sign, then I wouldn't know what the child needed, right? But yeah, we've used it for children to complete sentences. I had one client who was able, there was different screens on it, different categories that you could go through. One was food, activities, whatever it may be. And he, as soon as we would get there, is I want hot dogs. And then he'd be able to open it, and it would speak the whole sentence for him. So that was his form of communication, because that's how he was able to communicate with us, an audience, and then get his needs met too.
So how to determine the modality of communication? And honestly, this is not original to me. I adapted this from a textbook called Applied Behavior Analysis, 3rd edition. I won't bore you with reading this. You can certainly read it off the PowerPoint, but basically, it's very important for individuals to be able to request what they want. That's their first type of communication. And just imagine if you could not request what you needed or what you wanted, how frustrating that would be. And so if you can't request something you desire, you probably would exhibit behavior that most people wouldn't want to see. Now, here's the trick. A lot of times when I meet with parents, they aren't sure, or caregivers, they're not sure how to do this, and they haven't had instructions, and so they're grasping at straws, and they're trying to say, do you want this? Do you want this? Is this what you want? Or they already know what the person wants, and they're like, oh, I can tell he wants, juice, here's your juice. And so they're anticipating the child's needs and not letting them request it in their way. So what happens is the child doesn't learn to request what they want. They sit back and wait for it to be brought to them, or the individual, caregiver, parent, whomever, has taught them that they can misbehave, exhibit negative behavior, tantrum, whatever, and they'll get what they want eventually with that behavior. it serves the communication function, if you will, to get what they want. And it may not really be seen that way, and that actually may not be what the parent sees, but the parents reinforcing that behavior, or the caregiver, or the teacher, or you fill in the blank, is reinforcing that maladaptive behavior, because then when they finally arrive at what the person wants, they give it to them. And that then becomes the reinforcement for the behavior. And they think, okay, I can flop on the floor, kick, scream, and I'm going to get that waffle I want. And so then it becomes an issue. So one of the things that we need to do is look at each child, determine where they are in the continuum of communication, look at their abilities, cognitive, visual, auditory, motor. What can they do? Look at the environmental conditions, see what kind of assessments have been done. Do we need to do one? Evaluate all those variables, throw them into a pot, and see what can we do to teach this child some functional communication skills so they can get their needs met. So what we've got here, again, adapted from the ABA book, is a decision-making process for communication. So here's what we look at. Speech. Can the child imitate words and actions and understand words? Okay. If so, we're looking at verbal behavior. Okay. Sign language or writing. We would look at that if the child can imitate some actions, writes and comprehends words, can imitate sounds. We love jets by my office, which is where we are, and they're flying overhead right now, so I apologize for the noise. We would pick PECS if the child can understand pictures, but they can't imitate sounds, words, or actions. And we would pick teaching gestures and eye gaze if they can move any body part, but they don't understand symbols. Okay? So this is kind of a continuum, a decision-making process, basic as it is, for what we consider when we're looking at these 4 communication items.
And even with working with the screen that Nancy just showed us, it doesn't mean that children won't move up that either.
Exactly. It's a starting point.
Yes. Yep. And that's why when using PECS or even sign, we always pair it with the vocalization. So if I'm teaching the sign for cheese, which is really popular, I'm always pairing it specifically with the vocalization cheese, right? And then that helps develop our understanding of communication too. So the child will learn when I do this, I not only get cheese and mom says cheese or caregiver says cheese, that over time I may develop the sound cheese too, because that also gets me cheese. Or even with the PEC. If I had a picture of cheese or even a cookie, as soon as the child hands me that PEC, I'm also going to say cookie or cheese or whatever they are requesting, while I'm immediately providing that as a form of reinforcement too. I also need to make sure that when we're first teaching either sign or PECs or even vocalizations as commands or requests, that we provide whatever they're requesting immediately, so that they pair it with, as soon as I give Miss Nancy this picture of a cookie, I'm going to get a cookie. Right? So that's really important, but we also want to let people know that if a behavior analyst comes into your home to help teach your child a form of communication, and we say we're going to start with PECS, that doesn't mean that we don't believe vocal verbal language is in their future. That just means that that's what's going to be best for them and in this moment to get their needs met, to develop that form of communication, right? Because it's a human right to be able to communicate.
Mm-hmm. So one of the questions that we're usually asked is, how can we de-escalate behavior? What can I do? And so we just kind of listed some common problems and some helpful hints, hopefully in non-behavior analytic terms. We sometimes tend to ignore good behavior. I'm always telling my staff and supervisees, reinforcement is the key, because to change behavior, there has to be a reason. So in order to change behavior, we can't ignore good behavior because we feel like it should occur because that's expected. We have to recognize little things that are going right, look for opportunities to praise small successes. We need to reinforce good behavior. We tend to tolerate small annoying behaviors because they often lead into more frequent and greater behaviors. So address the little issues when appropriate. It is easier to turn around small problems than to try and deal with big ones. So try setting clear limits early on. We often wait for major problems to occur before we do anything about it. The longer you wait, the harder it gets. So don't wait to respond. Set those early limits. Waiting until the last minute to deal with a problem usually leads to a very frustrating experience. Here's one of those things that occurs that will probably make behavior last longer. And you'll see me, you're going to hear me say this a third time over here in the helpful hints. We often use warnings, threats, or ultimatums to gain compliance. My mother, if you don't do this right now, I'm going to tell your father, or whatever. We do ultimatums to gain compliance, and it often sets up authority control issues. You need to do this immediately. So avoid using warnings, threats, or ultimatums. Set clear limits and remind them that it's how they act that determines the consequence. I also say, go for choices. You're the one in control. You can say, oh, would you like to do this or this? You choose. That always works much better than backing someone into a corner, frankly, and saying you must do this. Must is always a red flag for anybody. And the other thing that I usually tell people is, after you give the choice, step back and let them decide. You don't have to push. Let them take a moment to decide. We might sometimes take a student's or a child's behavior personally. If you emotionally respond, then that generally escalates behavior, quite frankly, and will often encourage more behavior. So keep your delivery firm and even, and avoid responding to personal attacks. It's often used to sidestep an issue. When we have behavior here, and one of the things that I do when I'm teaching new RBTs and BCBAs and BCABAs what to do on the job in supervision is, you have to remove yourself personally from anything they might say, because it isn't personal. This is your job. And as a parent, it's your job to parent. Don't get your feelings hurt. You just kind of have to remove that from yourself and move forward. So you just have to be firm and even, and just know that it isn't personal. They want it to be, but you can't take it that way. Argumentative behaviors from students are really good at getting you pulled in. Do you find yourself spending a lot of time trying to convince them to act right? If so, you got pulled in. So if you find yourself getting pulled in, back up a step, set the limits, and don't get into power struggles with a student. One person may not allow a behavior to occur while another one does, and they don't see anything wrong with it. Mixed messages like this are the best bet in keeping a negative behavior alive and well. So have a simple plan that everyone can understand and consistently carry through. We have a tendency to focus on the problem behavior rather than focusing on the positive behaviors that are occurring. You heard me say this first. It's worth saying again. Focus on what the student is doing right. This is especially important when you're letting Johnny know how he's doing. We have a tendency to punish bad behavior versus rewarding positive ones. And I think it's human nature because you want to get rid of the bad behavior. But when possible, reinforce an alternative behavior. For example, Johnny interrupts all the time. Reinforce Johnny when he waits his turn. So one way to decrease the interrupting is ignore it. And when he's not interrupting, say, wow, Johnny, you did a fantastic job waiting your turn. I'm so proud of you. You get a star on your star chart or whatever. Oftentimes, we reinforce negative behavior without even knowing it. The belief is that the behavior will either go away, or if nobody makes a big deal out of it, then it won't be so bad. For example, Johnny makes an inappropriate statement and a family member laughs and makes an excuse for Johnny. Well, Johnny then says, woo, I got attention for it. I'm going to keep going. Attention's one of the biggest reinforcers we have, so be careful how you give it out. Address issues appropriately and consistently. Sometimes we over-respond and make mountains out of molehills, and the little things get a lot of attention when probably it would be better just to ignore them and let them drop. Neutral, non-emotional responses to problem behavior can be the hardest things to do. Use self-coaching, coping skills, or anything that works for you to stay cool, calm, and collected. We sometimes deliver reinforcers for no reason at all. We will just give them to the student non-contingently. Let Johnny earn his reinforcers through good performance. It's a huge thing. All right, here we go. We are at the end of this, so we're going to do our scenarios again and see if you pick the same thing, see if you have a different idea. And then we'll take questions, I guess, for the last 10 minutes. See, we timed it perfectly. So here we go. Number one, if you're at the doctor's office again with your child and your child's refusing to go to the nurse's station, screaming, kicking, flopping on the floor, refusing to move, your child's not verbal, what do? I'm not going to read your choices again. You just pick. We'll give you a minute. Why don't you put those pictures back? Then we can see. Yeah. Oh, it doesn't show us. Okay. Oh, okay. See how technological I am? This is why I'm not in charge of that. So I'm going to the next one, okay? This one is you're at the store with your child. Oh, does that cover them up? Okay. And it's clear they want something, but they're not able to tell you what it is. They begin to get frustrated, start to scream, cry. What can you do? So you're gonna just pick your answer this time, see if you would pick something different. Resources cannot be downloaded yet from the Barry Robinson website. I think it'll probably take at least a week, but there are resources for you from this webinar. You can download, like I said before, the PowerPoint, and there will be resources to download once we get them there and upload it. So, all right, we'll let you take it away with questions.
Sharing so we can see
Right.
everybody.
Thank you, Ashley and Nancy. That was a very, very informative training. We will go ahead and open it up now. I don't know if anyone has questions. You can either unmute and ask right away, or you can type them in the chat box. I do really quickly, before everyone signs off, just want to ask that if your screen name differs from your actual name, I see a couple just first names or maybe an iPhone, please make sure you type your actual name in the chat box, or email Debbie. I put her email in the chat as well so that we can ensure everybody gets the evaluation form and certificate of completion.
So one of the things while we're waiting is the first scenario,
Hey, Mary.
the one in the doctor's office, the, I guess, best answer, well, when I was a mom, I would have said, you're either going over my shoulder and we're hitting the road, we're going home. But because I wasn't a behavior analyst then, and I wouldn't have been able to handle it. But I guess at this point, I would have said other, and I would have come prepared. I would have prepared my child. I would have done some transition work with him first and prepared him for the fact we were going to the doctor. So my answer would have been other. There would have been a social story.
I originally said that I would sit down with my child, but then I heard you talking about reinforcing poor behaviors. And then I thought, okay, so then maybe I would ask the nurse for assistance.
That would have been a good, if
done.
That would have been good if it just happened there. But
yes.
your first instinct, you knew your child, you knew what you might need to do before you went.
Right.
That was a good choice.
Yes. So, and I have 4 children, and I'm now a behavioral health professional, and I work a lot with children and poor behaviors. So it really is going to depend on the child.
Mm-hmm. It sure is. And honestly, anything you can do ahead of time always makes your life easier.
And theirs as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Exactly.
Sure thing. The second one, much along the same line, other would be the answer there. And do you want to chime in? You can chime in too.
Oh, it's okay.
I don't care.
I changed my answer on that one as well. I went for other initially, and then I went with my verbal command asking my child to quiet down. So,
and if your child would your child do that?
It would have depended on which one of the 4 was throwing the
There you go.
Right.
There you go. So you go with what works individually with the child.
Right. I often tell my parents that if what they're doing isn't working and they continue to do what they're doing and it's not working, they're the ones that's crazy, not their child.
Yeah, there you go. You need to find what works. Exactly. Exactly. If no one has any questions, we can go. If you've got a question, we're happy to answer it. The last slide on the PowerPoint has both of our contact information. Feel free to contact us. We're happy to chat with you. Thank you very much.
Great job. Well done.
Attending. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming.
We appreciate it.
Thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope you guys have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.